Aloha and good evening, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Philosophy in the Forest. I'm Shasta, and I'm coming to you from the island of Hawaii. And in this episode of Philosophy in the Forest, I will be discussing Aristotle's Poetics. And Aristotle's Poetics was written in the late 4th century to mid 4th century BCE. And it's a detailed exposition of the literary arts. And something really interesting about Poetics is that even today, it's valued for screenwriters because Aristotle not only establishes genre, but he gives a very, very detailed outline of how to write a compelling story that is successful. Um, and also, what's very interesting is that Aristotle was Plato's student. And if we can remember from Book 10, Plato said that poetry and fiction are pretty much useless. That they corrupt us. But Aristotle, in turn, although he doesn't mention Plato at all in the Poetics, goes on to defend drama, fiction, and especially the tragedy, which he holds in the highest regard. And Aristotle was very thorough in his analysis of things, and perhaps he doesn't necessarily provide a lot of new ideas. He's more of an investigator, one that really dissects ideas. And in the Poetics, Aristotle basically he dissects literature and what makes a story good. And Aristotle really describes what a strong narrative is. So the Poetics can be very useful for writers or people who want to compose stories. And in Poetics, Aristotle discusses the essential narratives of a compelling story, and he also describes the various genres of story, which are comedy, tragedy, history, and the epic. And we assume that the Poetics was quite a bit longer than what we have left. The only thing that survived today was Aristotle's assessment of the tragedy, which is his very favorite. And Aristotle says that for a story to be successful, it needs to have a very concrete timeline that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And this structure, this just three-part structure, beginning, middle, and end to Aristotle, it's perfect. And in itself, a well-organized plot is something that's beautiful. But also Aristotle stresses this idea of character development, not only supplemental characters, but a compelling hero. So, for example, in The Lord of the Rings, we have Frodo, who is the hero, and this hero has to have a goal. And it should be basically like a single action. So, Frodo's goal is to destroy the ring. And the hero should also, not only have enemies, but the hero should also have great supporting characters. So there's Gandalf and Sam, along with the Dark Lord in The Lord of the Rings. So that's one of the things that The Lord of the Rings is an epic. So it's a compelling narrative because there is in Aristotle's opinion, it would be because this hero is so well written, and that Frodo also has this very well developed characters behind him to push the story forward. But moreover, Aristotle was really focused on the tragedy. So he explains, that the characters are important. So you have something like Hamlet and his friend Horatio, Hamlet's relationship to his mother, his relationship to Ophelia, his relationship to the king, who is his uncle. And all of these things, they create this intense emotional tension. And in Hamlet, before we get to the final act, the duel between Laertes and Hamlet, we're waiting for this. Hamlet is constantly delaying. That's why Hamlet is such a great tragedy, because he pushes the catharsis, that final moment where you realize all of the emotions. Hamlet pushes that to like the absolute last moment. And it's the way that the emotions are all purged at the end of these stories. Like in Romeo and Juliet, when Romeo finally stabs himself, over his love and loss of Juliet, the audience experiences this great pity, And that is catharsis. It's this release of emotions, the purging of emotions. And to Aristotle, this is the goal of a well-organized story, especially a well-organized tragedy. The catharsis is the second to the last part of the story. It eases the story into the denouement, the resolution. And at the end of the story, the audience should feel something. Like maybe in the movie The Titanic, when the boat sinks and Jack dies, maybe some of you have been provoked to emotion when you see Jack dying, or maybe some of you are upset that Kate Winslet's character didn't share the door with Jack. And in all this, in stories like that, we are able to work out ideas, and we're able to judge the characters in the story. We're able to judge Kate Winslet for not sharing the door with Jack at the end of Titanic. And it's that we're human beings, where we're able to learn so much from a tragedy. And a tragedy, it has this strong narrative because the characters move usually from a high place to a low place. And there's this twist of fate. So, Titanic is a good example of that, in that Kate Winslet's character is a privileged girl. And by the end of the story, she ends up being kind of like this freewheeling, I guess, a flapper woman. I'm not sure exactly what she becomes. And of course, Jack dies. Sorry if you guys haven't seen the Titanic, but the boat sinks. The Poetics is still used today just because of the thoroughness of the way in which Aristotle describes the genres of literature: the comedy, the history, the tragedy, the epic. And the surviving document that we have is mainly on tragedy. But Aristotle says a little bit about a comedy. The comedy is about foolish people and their shenanigans. And the characters in a comedy usually become better as the story progresses. And comedies, of course, have happy endings. And epic poetry is a simulation of serious stories in verse. So, of course, the Odyssey of Homer is a very famous epic. And it's the story of a man's journey home. And there's some seriousness in it because the first story, the Iliad, is actually about the Trojan War. And an epic can have a lot of smaller stories inside of it to be a more considerable work. So, like Lord of the Rings is a great example of an epic. There are 3 novels, 4 if you count The Hobbit. Although The Lord of the Rings is not a poem, so the Odyssey is a great example of an epic poem, and it doesn't have to have a fixed length. It can be very long. And also then there's the history, which seems like the epic, but it's set in a single time period. And a history could be something like Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, for example. But I think the reason that Aristotle really prefers the tragedy is because the tragedy is short. And the best tragedies should take place in a single day. So if we look at this, Romeo and Juliet really is the model of a great tragedy. I think the entire play takes course maybe over a single day, maybe 2 days. Maybe somebody can put that in the chat, but it's a short duration of time between Romeo meeting Juliet to then marrying her. I think it's 3 days. It's very short. It's less than a week anyway. So in this way, Aristotle regards the tragedy so powerful because it also shows how quickly our fate can change. So for your fate to be able to change in a single day is so powerful. To have the day be normal. And I think it calls into question, the nature of being itself, which is why Aristotle argues that tragedy is such a powerful medium, because it releases all these emotions and it gives us a feeling of sympathy for the hero, and pity and fear. That's really what Aristotle thinks is so important about tragedy, is that when human beings suffer, according to many modalities, we are able to learn so much. And because a tragedy can mimic suffering and mimic pity and mimic fear, that we're able to model the mistakes that the hero makes in a tragedy and learn from it. So a successful tragedy should have a single action that leads to the catharsis. So let's see. The moment of realization in Hamlet actually happens maybe in the graveyard. Maybe at that moment he comes to grips with who he is. And even more so in Oedipus Rex, the turning point in the story occurs when Oedipus discovers that he killed his father and married his mother. I mean, that's a classic Greek tragedy. In a tragedy, the climax is a crisis that leads to the hero's final transformation. The hero experiences a terrible twist of fate, like in Oedipus's. I mean, he married his mother, he murdered his father, and in Oedipus's case, he will actually ruin his life he's married to his mother, his dad is dead, so he blinds himself. At the end of the tragedy, the hero is in a way worse place. So Oedipus starts out as the king, and at the end of the story, he's a blind man who has the realization that he is that he's committed incest with his mother. And so Aristotle really argues that a successful tragedy should traumatize the audience, and so because it's that trauma that causes these intense emotions. So if we can think about, various stories that we've heard that have these traumatic endings, that, have caused us to cry. A story that makes us cry to Aristotle is very, very powerful. It's a great teaching tool. It has great didactic power. And the emotional weight of a tragedy carries such moral significance, because the audience feels it, So Poetics, it remains a useful guidebook for poets, playwrights, novelists, because it does offer a meticulous examination of literature and the dramatic arts. And Aristotle elaborates on the idea that art is mimicry, and that language can be a beautiful way of exploring ideas and emotions. And the Poetics is almost a scientific examination of the fundamental components of a story. And most importantly, if you take away anything, it's that a story should have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and that these plots should be simple, and that they should have a great hero who's able to arouse emotions in the audience. And if this isn't followed to Aristotle for all the writers out there, the story will not work. And so the Poetics becomes a great template for, any writer who wants to write an enthralling narrative that has the potential to please audiences, and not only that, move people and affect them and have resonance for many years to come. So thank you guys so much. Aloha and good night.